This is lesson 2, video 2 for Chem 1, unit 4 on electrons, the periodic table, and bonding. So we just finished talking about a little bit of the history of the periodic table, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the terminology and why it is the shape that it is. So when we talk about the periodic table, we're going to be looking at groups versus periods on the periodic table. And the groups are the columns. So we're talking about up and down. So if we look even here on our Flynn periodic table, these are numbered from 1 through 18 on the other side. So there are 18 groups to the periodic table. So 1 through 18. And we know from our summary table that we did is that they all have the same valence number and the same ion notation for the most part. There are some exceptions. So everything in group number 1, hydrogen through francium, is going to have one valence electron and be a +1 for its ion notation. So there is a repeating pattern to this. The other thing is they have similar properties. So sodium and potassium are actually very similar in how they behave because they have the same number of valence electrons. Now a period are the rows, so we're talking across. So if we look, those are numbered from 1 down through 7. These have the same main energy level for electrons. So if you remember, we talked about electrons filling up the electron cloud in energy levels. Well, everything in a period has electrons in the same last main energy level. So that is one way that we can talk about these also. But that doesn't mean that they have similar properties like over here. These can vary widely, so vary in properties. So from that, we can conclude one thing, and this is pretty important, and it kind of ties into our first lesson, that valence electrons dictate how elements behave. And that is an important thing. The valence electrons dictate how elements would behave. But we had one other thing that dictated what an element is. And we'll tie that in here in a second. So up here, we have the term periodic. So we have this periodic table of elements. And what periodic means is repeating. I spelled that wrong. Repeating. So we have a repeating pattern of element behavior. And from that, we can develop what is known as the periodic law. And the periodic law states that physical and chemical properties of an element are a function of atomic number and valence electrons. So these two things, atomic number, which tells us what an element is. So if I said that we are looking at element number 20, we know that that is calcium. So that tells us what the element is. And we know based on its position and number of valence electrons that it has 2 valence electrons, which makes it fairly reactive, so we can determine its behavior. So the physical and chemical properties of that are based on these 2 things: atomic number and valence electrons.